Hi everyone, welcome to the third video of my Emacs as a Microsoft Word Killer series. So today I'm going to talk about some tips on fixing configs for multiple platforms. So this is especially useful if you have Emacs installed on, say, for example, Windows and Linux. Okay, one of the problems with some of the previous videos was that it was a bit too long, so I'm going to trying to make this short by recapping quickly what we did before. So we did some cool abrev mode as autocorrect. Basically we used a Emacs built-in abrev mode, which basically takes a short form and expands it to a long form. Instead we use it as autocorrect, or even as a way to type quickly. For example, typing TT becomes the. We also revisited some of our Hydra, and I'm not going to go into detail, but basically Hydra is a very cool way to trigger more convenient shortcuts. So if you want some tips on exploring Hydra, you can also try something like Doom Emacs or NeoVim or Spacemacs. They have something called leader key, and what it does is that it triggers some key maps, and it's a good thing to explore because you understand what is a key map. So you can try, you can use frameworks or Emacs frameworks as a way to explore packages that are usually commonly used among some experienced Emacs users. One of them is Hydra mode. In the previous video I also presented this article called "In the Beginning Was the Command Line" by Neil Stephenson. That was mostly as a way to in response to one Reddit user, but also as a way to sort of like introduce the why we are using Emacs. The problem, of course, is that I was not exactly sure how I was gonna make my video the intended audience, but one of the things that the article taught me was that Emacs really is an operating system. So I recommend checking that article out. It's a bit about the history of operating systems and why is it, despite all the advancement in software, we are still using command line interfaces, and how does Emacs fit into all this. And as the meme or joke goes on, people always say that Emacs is an operating system, and somehow that didn't sit quite well with me. When I read the article, it all started to make sense, because there's no tangible boundary between an app and an operating system, and Emacs famously, it blurs all this boundary between everything. Of course, the problem with that statement is that it's still too vague, but it's cool nonetheless, and especially because in Emacs code is data, so that means we can change the fundamental nature of how our operating system behaves. So it's unlikely Linux is gonna take over anytime soon. Companies, not only companies but also users who probably know the benefit of Linux, is it going to move anytime soon because it's too magical for most people? We can't do much about it, but what we can do is have as much fun as possible turning our so-called text editor into a very interesting operating system, almost like an operating system. Okay, so now back to the focus of this video. So I'm going to show you how I manage configs between multiple platforms using conditionals and def-var. So everyone knows what conditionals are, but we can also start with conditionals and gradually move to def-var, and I'm going to explain what def-var is in a moment. So I'm going to show later how it looks on Windows. So one of the problem that we're trying to solve here is actually, it happens a lot on when you install Emacs on Windows is that Windows sometimes doesn't behave as expected. It depends too much on the version of Emacs and all that, but in my case what happened was, even though I fed it this command, which actually forces Emacs to load as the first init this file, basically you can get this from the variable early init file, early dash init dash file. Even though you feed this into Windows, it will still try to load this file app data slash roaming slash dot emacs. So the problem, of course, is that what ends up happening if you modify configs every now and then is that you would have to copy, you have to make sure every time you update something, you copy this file into this file and all over the place. You have to make sure all these copies match. So we're going to use conditionals, very natural way to solve this, but also you can also use devvar. So we're going to see how we're going to do that. Okay, so now we're on our Windows, and this is the, as you can see at the bottom, app data slash roaming slash dot emacs file. So all these all that's happening here is a bunch of variables getting defined. You can ignore most of the set queue. You can pay attention to the devvar. So what devvar I'm going to show later how this devvar is used later. So this is the variable I'm using in my main configuration file later, and depending on which platform I'm on, Windows or Linux, it will actually use a different value depending on which platform I'm on. So instead of using conditionals, I'm using devvar, and because Windows reads this file first, it will actually define var, and later on I'm going to explain what devvar does. Basically, devvar will define a variable just like setq, but if this variable is already defined, it will be ignored. So I'm gonna explain a bit about devvar later. And then another variable that we used here that also is defined using devvar is this one. These are my notes, my main notes, my main org files, and depending on which platform I'm on, whether it's Windows or Linux, it's stored in a different directory. And using devvar, I don't have to worry about making sure Windows loads the exact same file. As long as the main configuration file is exactly the same, devvar kind of takes care of the scope. As I was making this video, one of the things I noticed actually was that the properties of my shortcut, which actually I click on every time I run, actually doesn't get fed in the argument of the initial init file. So apparently that's the reason why it still decides to read appdata slash roaming slash dot emacs, is because I'm running it just like this. So you can actually add some options here if you like, but if you do decide it to run like this, it will still work. So that means there's actually a more ELSP way to actually make your Windows behave properly. So in this case, I'm just using devvar. I'm also defining this file, which is early init file, and this is the file that gets loaded before we actually load our main configuration. So in the first file, we load before it loads the main configuration file, which is this one, win only pre-init.28, and this file gets run first, and then it loads the main configuration. So the configuration file here is exactly the same as on Windows and Linux. Okay, so now we're back on Linux, and we already saw some of our devvar in that .emacs file. So we're going to explain a little bit what devvar does here. So if you look at the link here, we see that devvar, according to this link, emacs.stackexchange.com, if the variable already has a value, then it does nothing. So basically, devvar, if the variable already has a value, it does nothing. So that means if you have two statements like this, it should be 1, 2, 3, 4. Of course, the problem is that it's not that straightforward, because in modern Emacs nowadays we have something called lexical scoping versus dynamic scoping. Okay, so before getting all confused what this means, basically lexical is just a fancy word for text or word, or maybe groups of character. This makes it a bit unintuitive. So modern Emacs nowadays uses dynamic scoping. What does this mean for us is not that complicated. All you have to remember is that devvar in modern Emacs respects scoping. So in old Emacs, devvar behaves most of the time as expected. So for example, if you checked out Zahli's link here, if you were to copy this command, according to the old Emacs, so this is an old article, it should evaluate, and the value should be remain as 4, which means because devvar is this value is already defined, and devvar sees this value is defined, so this second line here doesn't do anything. However, if you were to copy this and we were to evaluate in modern Emacs, you can see the value actually remains as 3, if you can see at the bottom there. So how do we get around this? Basically, the best way to think of it is that it respects scoping. That's all you have to remember. So that means in this second example here, devvar doesn't behave as expected. It becomes 1, 2, 3, 4. That's because it's in the same scope. However, because in this first example here you have a local variable, it actually respects the scope, and the value remains as 9 as the first value, which is 999. So we can see here the value respects the scope. So devvar behaves as expected. But if this is still too confusing, you don't have to think too much about this. Basically, it's just a configuration convention. So what does this mean for us is that one example of a practice is, say you were to load a file, some file called sumfile.el. So inside this sumfile.el, you can actually put a bunch of devvars. And that means, here's the interesting bit, when you actually move back into this file, the scope kind of changes. So I'm not an expert on this, but what happens is that when you load the file, it's considered like a different scope, so that when you go back here, the scope is respected and this devvar behaves as expected. So as we saw in our example, in our Windows example, the scope here is defined And when we move into this file, the def var here is ignored because the def var behaves as expected. In the case of Linux here, because the variable is not defined, def var assigns a new value. Okay, so now if we go to our Linux main configuration, so this actually looks exactly the same as in my Windows. You can see that this variable that we showed in our appdata/roaming/.emacs is used at several places. Here it's defined as config/emacs. So that means under Linux we use a different value, and under Windows we actually use a different value. So instead of using conditionals at certain spots, we are using def var, and we can safely load our files. So if you have trouble using def var, you can always start with conditionals and think of tricks of how to move it gradually to def var. So in this conditional, you can see it actually checks for the version of Emacs, and I can load files depending on my version. So the whole point of this, of course, is that we can actually focus on one config and forget about managing configs across multiple platforms. So this allowed me to transition to 29 smoothly. So first I actually focused mostly on my Emacs 28, and then I just copied it to Emacs 29, most of the same config, and then I focused adding stuff from there on. So as long as you have some backup or version control going on, whatever happens to your Emacs, whatever, you can always make sure you're loading the correct version. So of course with the condition you can also check against system type. So as you can see, Emacs can be aware of your operating system. In this case it's GNU Linux, or if it's Windows you can check against the version of Windows. Okay, so in the Windows file appdata/roaming/.emacs, there was also another variable, early -init file, that actually defines the first file it loads. In this case it's win-only pre-init.el. So what that variable does is that it forces Emacs to behave as properly as usual. And if Windows sometimes behaves different, we can also make sure that the first file it reads has just the dev vars, and that's all we need. So you put your dev vars here, or dev vars somewhere here. So the advantage of this is, of course, you can selectively trigger functionality in Windows. So there's an interesting question here, is that doesn't this seem hacky? Well, we are managing configs across multiple platforms, so it's not as predictable as we'd like to think, and we should also avoid kind of like architectural thinking. I can't think of a better word. It's just my ways to say you shouldn't be obsessed about organizing code, just like in object-oriented programming. Organizing code is not always the same thing as being productive in code. Usually when you organize code, there's no logic involved. So when you think about organizing code too much, you can actually make simple code become complicated. So what you want to do instead is use tools in the language itself. In our example, dev var kind of helps managing the scope. So as long as we use the tools in the language, we're good to go. So you can start with conditionals and move to dev var later. And if you decide to actually define the home directory, unlike me, then you can put all your dev vars inside a different file. But sometimes it's not always predictable. So here's another case I found that is actually very similar to mine as I was making this video. So this case is very similar to ours. So if I click this link, and in this case, this fella right here decided to try SSHing into Windows, and Emacs decides to read the .emacs from this home folder instead. So obviously same problem here. The solution would be to copy the entire init.el or emacs.el, whatever. Every time he updates his configuration, he would have to copy it and make it sure it syncs all over the place. So a solution is simple. Instead of doing that, we just put a early init file inside here and inside here, and make sure we have a bunch of dev vars defined. Okay, so I'm not sure what happened to the font, but so as long as we defined our early init file, things should work out just fine. Sorry, there was something wrong with the alright, so as long as we define this file in this variable in Windows, everything should work out fine, and we can safely ignore this in the case of Linux. So if you're wondering what this is, it's just a way to make sure a file is being read before Emacs loads our main init file. Okay, so before I end this presentation, I'm gonna show you a bit of what might come next. So I'm not sure if I'm going to do this one in the same video, same series. So one of the things I did when I was trying to present this was actually I created this, I discovered this cool trick using PlantUML. So this PlantUML code block actually evaluates to the diagram you saw just now. So if you guys want to do some presentation, you can use org reveal. That's a org reveal, and all I had to do was actually, because I have my Emacs Hydra mode set up, it's actually pretty cool. All I have to do is type ;vv answer y, and just like that my presentation is updated. So it's pretty cool. And let's say I want to add another see, I'm changing the text here, Windows. I'm changing this to some random text. So all I have to do is type ;vv and answer y, and I have my diagram updated. So this is a pretty cool trick. I recommend it if you once you get comfortable with Emacs and you develop a habit of writing a lot. It's very easy to actually transform your random notes into a presentation. So you should explore org reveal, reveal.js, maybe PlantUML in Emacs. Alright, so that's it for my video, and please support my channel, like and subscribe as usual. If you like what I do, if you think it's important, please consider buying me coffee. Link in the description. You can use the Coffee link. It accepts most debit cards and credit cards. Or you can use PayPal if you have PayPal. And that's it for today, and thanks for watching. Bye.